Hey everybody, I'm Emily Sweeney from the Boston Globe, and I want to thank you for joining us for this latest round of lessons brought to you by the New England First Amendment Coalition. During this class, you'll learn about remote public access to government meetings in Rhode Island. And be sure to check out our previous classes on our YouTube channel and on our website, nefac.org. Before we start, I want to recognize the estate of Gloria Negri for supporting these classes. Gloria was a trailblazing journalist at the Boston Globe for more than 50 years, and this program is part of her legacy of newsroom education and her lifelong commitment to local journalism. We also want to thank the Rhode Island Foundation and the New England Society of News Editors for their continued support. And a big thanks to you for taking the time today to learn how to keep government open and accountable in your state. With us today is John Marion. He's the executive editor of Common Cause Rhode Island, a position he's held since 2008. John, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Emily, and thanks to NEFAC for putting these on and for having me. Delighted to be here. I'm John Marion from Common Cause Rhode Island. We're a good government organization that has been working on, among other issues, transparency in government involving public records and open meetings for over 50 years. I will start out by saying that though I'm going to talk about the open meetings law, I'm not an attorney, and this isn't legal advice. I don't want to get myself in any trouble, but I am familiar with the law, both as a consumer, as somebody who goes to a lot of public meetings, and also as somebody who has worked over the years, as you'll hear, to reform the law. So today, what I'm hoping you'll get out of the next half hour is kind of a brief, broad overview of what in Rhode Island we call the Rhode Island Open Meetings Act, or OMA, how it prohibits actually public bodies from meeting online, although it doesn't necessarily prohibit them from providing access to the public. Sort of the state of that access for the public online as of 2024, what the impact of COVID was, at least temporarily, and then finally what the reform efforts have looked like in the post-COVID environment. So as I said, I want to start out with sort of the Open Meetings Act more generally. Unlike a lot of states, Rhode Island's law is quite broad in that it applies to all public bodies in the state, with two exceptions that I'll talk about in a little bit. And it does that by, essentially defining the scope of the law through three terms that you can see in this slide. It has to be a meeting of a public body where a quorum is present. And while you would think these would be pretty obvious terms, there's a little bit of nuance. And as the Attorney General says, when he's issuing decisions where people filed complaints, it's a very fact-specific analysis when the Open Meetings Act applies. I think quorum is a fairly self-explanatory term, although it's not specifically said in the open meetings law in Rhode Island. Rolling quorums are illegal. So members of a public body who talk to each other in a rolling fashion, not all together at once, can still be convening a meeting. A meeting, again, is somewhat self-obvious or somewhat obvious, but there are instances, for instance, where there's a quorum of a public body together. They are meeting, but it is not a public meeting or an open meeting. They might be marching in a parade together. And that's because it has to be an instance where they're discussing or acting upon a matter over which they have supervision, control, or jurisdiction or advisory power. That last one is important. Rhode Island's law, like I said, is very broad. It includes advisory bodies, which a lot of states don't, which we think is a good thing. So even bodies that don't have statutory power to do things, but are purely advisory, are subject to our law. Just a couple other things, particularly for reporters, that I think are important to know about the law in Rhode Island. One is that, like everywhere, it requires that there be public notice of a meeting. In our case, it's 48 hours notice. It's referred to as supplemental notice. And that 48-hour calculation does not include weekends and holidays. So you can't post an agenda on a Friday afternoon for a Monday morning meeting and meet that. And that was an important reform we won a couple of years ago. And the notice or the agenda that has to be posted, both physically posted at the place of the meeting and also online with the Secretary of State, must have the date, time, location of the meeting, when the notice was posted, and most important, a statement specifying the business to be discussed. And that's been interpreted as requiring a pretty specific agenda. You can't put vague things like president's report or old or new business on an agenda. It's too vague. Like most places, they're also allowed to have closed meetings or executive sessions. I won't go through all the reasons, but there are essentially 10 reasons, including collective bargaining or investigations or student discipline in the case of a school committee. So in the law 42, 46, sections 4 and 5, you can read those 10 reasons they can go into a closed meeting. The public, even though it's not said directly in the statute, it's been interpreted by courts that the public has a right to record meetings as long as it's not disruptive. The public body can put reasonable limits on that. So you can't set your tripod up right in front of the chair of the committee, maybe, but you have a right to record a meeting as long as you're not being disrupted. Under Rhode Island law, the public does not have a general right under the broad law to provide public comment. In certain instances, certain types of public bodies might, by statute, require a comment or by regulation, but it is not a blanket requirement of all public bodies for all public meetings. As I alluded to earlier, there are two really important exemptions from the Open Meetings Act. The judiciary is specifically exempted under the statute from the Open Meetings Act. And then by an interpretation of the Attorney General, the legislature is also exempt, although the legislature says that they voluntarily comply with the statute. So, the topic today is about online meetings. Rhode Island's law prohibits the members of the public body from meeting online generally. Unlike what we got used to during COVID, which I'll talk about in a second, as of 2024, June of 2024, when we're recording this, members of a public body cannot participate in a meeting remotely in any way. And the section of the statute that prohibits that is spelled out in the slide. There are 5 important exemptions to this. They may meet remotely to discuss scheduling the meeting. So if there is an email that they're all discussing when they're going to meet, that's okay. If somebody is on active duty in the armed services, they can Zoom in or conference call into a meeting. Someone who has a disability and is a member of the public body can also participate remotely, but they have to have an individual waiver from what's called the Governor's Commission on Disabilities. And the terms of that are laid out in the section of the statute in the bullet in the slide. And I said individual waiver because the Governor's Commission did try to give a blanket waiver, I believe last year, the year before, but sort of backed off that. They were headed toward providing a blanket waiver for anybody who was immunocompromised to self determined that they deserved to participate remotely, but ultimately we are still at the point where you have to prove to the Governor's Commission on Disability that you have a qualified disability and need a waiver. Finally, there are two public bodies who are singled out by the law and allowed to have remote meetings. The Board of Trustees of the University of Rhode Island received this, I believe, in 2019 or 2020, prior to the pandemic. They asked for this exception. And then last year, the General Assembly created something called the Rhode Island Life Science Hub Board of Directors, and allows that group to also meet online. We are seeing a trend in Rhode Island toward public bodies seeking to have this remote option one by one. We just defeated a bill that was seeking it this legislative session. As I'll explain in a minute, sort of the reform groups, including Common Cause, NEFAC, the ACLU, and others, want to create a permanent solution that, like many states have, to this problem. We don't want to go public body by public body. So, summarize this, like in Rhode Island, for the most part, public bodies cannot meet online, and individual members can't participate online in a hybrid meeting. That does not, and I wasn't talking about how the public can access and journalists can access, because as our Attorney General likes to say, our Open Meetings Act is a floor, not a ceiling, when it comes to remote access for the public. And so prior to the pandemic, many public bodies were recording, and in some instances, live streaming their meetings in a way that the public could consume them but not participate. After the pandemic, we see that has continued, and in fact, we're seeing more of it than we did before the pandemic. But we're not seeing from this 2023 ACLU report. It's largely one way, where the public and journalists can view, often in real time, but they can't participate, ask questions, participate in public comment periods. So as you can see, of the 39 cities and towns in Rhode Island, 82% are making live streaming available. And for school committees and school boards, about 3/4 are. Only one school committee is allowing people to participate remotely, so making it two-way communication. And about a little more than a quarter, 12 city or town councils offer remote participation. So while remote participation for members of the public body is prohibited, remote participation by members of the public is not prohibited, but it's also not required. And while we see some public bodies doing this, particularly at the municipal level, not really state public bodies, certainly we're not seeing what I would describe as widespread use, because we don't see a majority of public bodies doing this. Of course, as I've alluded to, we all remember a time not that long ago when the COVID pandemic basically dictated that all of this was occurring online. That started in Rhode Island that fateful week in March 2020, when Governor Raimondo issued Executive Order 20-05. The key language in that executive order is on your screen, and it basically lifted that prohibition against online participation by members of public bodies, and it required what it calls, that last phrase, adequate alternative means for members of the public body to participate. That language, I believe, was taken actually from the Massachusetts executive order that was issued at the same time. There's a later part of the executive order that says essentially if members of the public at a pre-COVID meeting were allowed to participate, then they have to be offered adequate alternative means to participate in the meeting as well. So essentially, it was an attempt to kind of put into virtual space what we had in person prior to the pandemic. This executive order was reissued several times during the pandemic. It was refined as it was reissued. Open government groups, including NEFAC and Common Cause, pressed the administration to put some guardrails on this about public notice and things like that, so that the public interest was protected when these online meetings were occurring. It was allowed to lapse in 2021, and then when the Delta wave came, it was reissued and refined to accommodate for hybrid meetings. Ultimately, it lapsed on March 19th, 2022. And at that point, Rhode Island reverted to an Open Meetings Act that was pre-pandemic. So unlike Massachusetts, for instance, which is still sort of extending some of the remote participation that started with COVID, Rhode Island has gone back to a law that is pre-pandemic. There were attempts to prevent that from happening. In 2021, a couple of bills were introduced. And then in 2022, two other bills were introduced. And they would have extended the executive order, not made it permanent, and then transitioned the state to a sort of post-pandemic Open Meetings Act that allowed some, but not all public bodies to have meetings online. These bills passed the House, but not the Senate. And then ultimately, in 2023 and 2024, no bills have been introduced to do this. The open government community largely moved on to some public records reforms that we were seeking. That said, the public interest community kind of created a statement of principles of what we would like to see in a post-pandemic Open Meetings Act when it comes to remote participation. And we would like to create in the law sort of three categories of public meetings: in person, fully remote, and hybrid. And then we would like to let public bodies hold meetings depending on what types of public bodies they are, hold meetings that range from fully remote meetings to fully in-person meetings. And we kind of divided the public bodies into three categories. One are the public bodies that we think most need sort of the accountability that comes with people being able to attend in person and having the members of the public body there in person. And that includes city and town councils, so all of which are elected in Rhode Island, all school boards and committees, some of which are elected, zoning boards, planning boards, and the roughly 24 quasi-public entities that exist in the state. And we would like to see the membership of those bodies have to be there in person, but they would offer remote access and participation for members of the public. For advisory only bodies, remember I said they are subject to the open meetings law in Rhode Island. We'd like to let them go fully remote with some guardrails in place. And then for everybody in between, we would like to allow them to have hybrid meetings where less than a quorum of members can participate online, but a quorum is there in person and the public has remote access under certain circumstances. So, as I mentioned, the open government community is looking to draft a bill that we'll introduce in our legislature in 2025 that would embrace these principles. So we think it's a thoughtful way to do this. We think there is a balance. There is certainly a a value for the public to participate remotely that we all recognize, parents being able to get the dinner on the table for their kids and go to their kids' school committee meeting. But we also think there is a value to having members of public bodies, particularly those that are most powerful and have the most sort of direct control over the public's lives, to be there in person, in part because some of our experience we saw with journalists, during COVID, we would see public bodies just shut the Zoom off at the end of the meeting because they didn't want to answer a question from a journalist. And so we think, particularly for elected bodies, the requiring them to be there in person so that the journalist can kind of follow up and ask a question when the meeting's over is incredibly important. So that's why we have a somewhat nuanced approach to this. We've also developed, finally, and we'll incorporate into the bill, what we think are a comprehensive set of guardrails that protect the public interest. So things like, requiring the Zoom link to be on the agenda, requiring that the camera be on for a member of a public body, requiring that roll call votes be taken for non-unanimous votes. Just ways to make sure that the screen doesn't become a barrier to public access, and it doesn't, moving things online doesn't harm the public interest, and that the public can fully know what's happening and what's being done in their name. So that's sort of the state of play in Rhode Island at the moment. I'm happy to answer questions. If you have, follow-up questions, you can reach me, my email address there. That's our office phone number, but it also rings on my cell. We're on social media, on Twitter or X and Facebook at Common Cause Rhode Island.
Thanks, John. That was a great overview. And we do have one question that came through from our live audience. And Mary asks, in Rhode Island, are packets, aka documents, distributed to members during a public meeting de facto public documents? Yeah, so great question, Mary, and nice to hear from you, Mary. There is, in our public records law, there is some language about a document, and I don't have the exact language in front of me, but a document, I can't remember if the operative word is presented at a public meeting as a public document. But if you look at where it's placed in our public records law, it's placed under one of the exemptions dealing with preliminary notes and so forth. That has been interpreted by the Attorney General as only that subcategory of documents enumerated in that exemption become public once they're presented at a public meeting. So what does all that mean? It means anything else that can be exempted under any of the other exemptions under the law. There are over 20 exemptions. Even if it's presented at a public meeting, that can be withheld from the public under what we call APRA, the Access to Public Records Act. So the most sort of infamous example of this was when then State Treasurer Raimondo was chairing the State Investment Commission meeting. There were some hedge fund performance documents that were presented and were withheld from a reporter. And when that was reviewed by the Attorney General said, because they're exempt as sort of proprietary business information, and they don't fall under that specific part of APRA, then they can be withheld. Worth noting, our public records bill in 2024 that unfortunately didn't pass would
both require that any documents presented or discussed at a public meeting are included in the packet that goes out 48 hours or more in advance. And it would make that apply to all documents, so not just that specific subcategory of documents. And you're exactly right, Mary. We see quite a bit of resistance, particularly, I think, as you know, kind of the Commerce Corporation, but others have, pushed back at requests and used that Attorney General's decision sort of to shield those documents.
John, thank you so much for a great presentation. This was really informative.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful to have this opportunity, Emily, and NEFAC. I know Justin's not with us, but just really grateful for NEFAC for putting these on.
Excellent. And yeah, I encourage everybody, if you haven't yet, to please check out our other classes, which you can find on our website, nefac.org, and our YouTube channel. So thanks, everybody. Until next time.